So how many of you guys have heard of the movie Zeitgeist? Now, before I started learning theology and ancient Christianity, I watched this movie years ago. And to be quite honest, it scared the hell out of me. It actually made me question my faith. However, I did not go and look for myself to see if any of these claims were in fact true. So what I decided to do was sit down with all of my books and go through the classic mythological tales in order to see if any of these claims that Zeitgeist made are true. I want to go through some of the gods that the movie Zeitgeist says Jesus copied or stole from. And then I want to look at their history. I want to see if any of these claims are true. And then at the end, we'll wrap it up with my conclusion. First, we have the Egyptian god Horus. So the first claim would be that Horus was born on December 25th. However, when I looked into it, there is zero evidence to support this claim. Claim number 2, Horus was born of a virgin. Now the fact is that the earliest and most reliable sources for the story of Horus in Egypt say nothing about a virgin birth. In fact, the earliest writings tell us that the seed of Osiris went into Isis. Therefore, it was not a virgin conception. Claim number 3, Horus' birth, star in the east. The specific mention of a star appearing in the east at Horus' birth is not explicitly stated in any single surviving ancient Egyptian text. It was a concept that was implied later on, through centuries, through the association of Horus with the rising sun. Horus was born in a swamp, and his birth was not heralded by any angel. There was no star, and there is no evidence to support this claim. Claim number 4, Horus adored by 3 kings. There is no record anywhere in Egyptian history or any manuscripts that say that there were 3 kings visiting Horus at his birth. Not a single ancient manuscript to support this claim. Claim number 5, Horus was a teacher at 12 years old. Nowhere in ancient Egyptian text or mythology does it state that Horus was a teacher at the age of 12. This claim is not supported by any archaeological evidence and is considered a misconception often used in comparisons to the biblical story of Jesus, which is not historically accurate when applied to Horus. Claim number 6, Horus was baptized. Again, there is no record of Horus being baptized in any ancient Egyptian text. In fact, the Egyptians did not even practice baptism, which is a religious practice associated with Christianity and Catholicism. Claim number 7, Horus had 12 disciples. There's no archaeological evidence that supports this either, nor is there any manuscript evidence that supports this claim. The claim that Horus had 12 disciples, Horus had only 4 disciples, but at some point in his story, there is reference to 16 followers, a group of unnumbered followers who joined Horus in a battle called Mesuni. Claim number 8, Horus performed miracles. Horus certainly performed miracles. He was, after all, described as a god, and most gods of ancient mythology perform miracles. But there was no mention of exorcising demons, raising people from the dead, or walking on water. None of these miracles that Jesus actually performed and have eyewitness accounts for. Claim number 9, Horus called the Lamb of God, the Light. The fact is that none of these titles are in Egyptian history, but Horus is called by several names you might expect for any god in mythology. The great god, chief of the powers, master of heaven, and avenger of his father. Horus was not called the Christ. This word in Egyptian means burial. It wasn't a title at all. Claim number 10, Horus was crucified and was dead for 3 days. When reading the stories of Horus, I can't see any evidence that he died at all. In fact, in the vast majority of Egyptian narratives, there is no crucifixion story. Now let's move on to Mithra. Born of a virgin, born on December 25th, had 12 disciples, performed miracles, dead for 3 days, and resurrected. So Mithras was not born of a virgin. Mithras was actually born out of a solid rock, leaving a hole in the side of a mountain or quote-unquote cave. And also, the earliest version of this part of the Mithraic mythology emerges 100 years after the New Testament. So it would seem that they actually took this from Christianity. Mithras was not born on December 25th. There is no ancient source that mentions a specific date for Mithras' birth. The date of December 25th is not supported by any evidence prior to the Romans choosing to celebrate Mithras, the ancient Persian god, on December 25th. Mithras did not have 12 disciples, and there is no evidence for any of this in the Mithraic tradition of Iran or Rome. Now, did Mithras perform miracles? This is true. However, this was not uncommon, again, for most mythological gods to perform miracles or magic, as they all had supernatural powers, And there's no historical evidence to support these miracles actually even happened, let alone Mithras existed at all. And there's absolutely no evidence that Mithras was crucified. The story is about Mithras slaying a threatening bull in a heroic deed. That is not anything to a crucifixion or being nailed to a cross and dying for the sins of all mankind. There is no evidence in the Mithraic tradition supporting the claim that Mithras was buried in a tomb or ever even died at all, nor is there any evidence Mithra was resurrected. Now I can go on with all these so-called gods in the film Zeitgeist. However, when we hear claims such as the ones made in this film, it's important that we test these claims, guys. Is there any historical truth to these claims? Are there any manuscripts that contain eyewitness accounts, or are they just oral traditions? Is there any archaeological evidence to support names, events, people, places within these stories? We ought not test historical claims on similarities, but rather on accuracy and facts instead. Objective truth. Here is an example of not believing something historical simply due to the similarities in the story. Did you know that 14 years before the Titanic sank, a book was published in 1898? It was a novel by author Morgan Robertson called Futility. And this story is identical to the real-life Titanic. The ship was called the Titan. It was the largest ocean liner in the world, was said to be unsinkable, sailed across the northern Atlantic Ocean just like the Titanic did, hit an iceberg, sank, and it happened in April. Had just above the legal minimum number of lifeboats, and there was a catastrophic loss of life. Now when we look at the Titanic, the ship was called Titanic, was the largest ocean liner in the world, was said to be unsinkable, sailed across the northern Atlantic Ocean, hit an iceberg and sank. The event happened in April, had just above the legal minimum number of lifeboats, also had a catastrophic loss of life. Now does this mean that the Titanic copied the Titan? A fictional boat from a fictional story? Or can we know that the Titanic was a real boat in history, even though we were not alive to witness it, and that the Titan never really existed, and is just a fictional story from a fictional novel? Of course we can know this, because we can test it. We have evidence for the Titanic that we do not have for the Titan. We have eyewitness accounts, artifacts. We have seen the wreckage and continue to visit it. We have documented records from people who were there and from the people who were involved. And the same goes for the New Testament and the life of Jesus. We have evidence that we do not have for all of these other so-called gods. Reliable eyewitness accounts, archaeological evidence, manuscript evidence, early writing closer to the events actually than anything else in ancient antiquity, guys. There are more manuscripts for the New Testament than there are for any other ancient writing in ancient antiquity. No book even comes close to the manuscripts we have for the New Testament. And that's not to mention the sources in the first century that are not even from the Bible, that are outside of the Bible. So in my conclusion, even if all these so-called gods shared the same similarities as Jesus, it still wouldn't affect the life of Jesus. Jesus is the only one out of all these so-called gods who is supported by evidence. Evidence that supports the claims of the people, places, and events were all recorded in history, and we can see them today. Accurate accounts that have passed all of the test. You wouldn't even need the Bible to know the life of Jesus or the events, the people, and geographical places in the Old Testament and the New Testament, based off ancient sources within the time and life of Christ, within the first century. Now here are just two examples of ancient sources who wrote about Christ and the Christians who were not Christians themselves, thus proving the validity of the evidence we have for the events that took place and the people and the places inside the Bible that we do not have for any of these so-called gods. Flavius Josephus writes, "Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men amongst us, had condemned him to the cross, Those that loved him at the first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive again the third day, as the divine prophets had foretold. These and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him, and the tribe of Christians, so named from him, are not extinct at this day. So this is a Jewish historian who is not a Christian writing about Christ being crucified by Pontius Pilate, known to be God, resurrecting and appearing to his disciples, performing miracles, and at that time his apostles were still alive. And Tacitus writes, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians, by the populace. Christus, speaking about Christ, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius, at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilatus, and a most mischievous superstition. Thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. Accordingly, an arrest was first made of all who pleaded guilty. Then upon their information an immense multitude was convicted, not so much of the crime of the firing of the city, as of the hatred against mankind. Mockery of every sort was added to their deaths. Covered with the skins of beasts, they were torn by dogs and perished, or were nailed to crosses. Now Tacitus is talking about the apostles who were all martyred for following Christ, after Nero had blamed the Christians for the fire that happened in Rome. He also confirms that Pontius Pilate was the procurator at the time that Jesus was crucified, and he was crucified under Pontius Pilate, confirming that people believed at that time that Jesus was God and performed miracles by saying mischievous superstition. So these were not stories made up later on. This was happening within the first century, and this is outside of the Bible. Now, what evidence do any of these other so-called gods have? They have nothing. There is zero evidence to support any of the claims in any of their books. Thus, I find it reasonable to believe that Jesus Christ was God, he did die, he was crucified, and he did rise on the third day. And we have an abundance of evidence to support the claim.